What if everything you believe about the Greek oracles is wrong, not because history lied to you, but because someone long ago wanted you to never see what truly happened behind those sacred walls? The ancient world treated the oracles as divine bridges between mortals and the gods, yet hidden beneath the marble columns, the incense smoke, and the whispered prophecies existed a reality far more unsettling. This was not simply a spiritual institution, it was a carefully constructed system of control, fear, and selective enlightenment designed to bind entire civilizations to the will of a chosen few. Imagine approaching a revered oracle, trembling with hope, believing that fate itself waits to be revealed to you. The air is heavy with ritual heat, the stone floor cold beneath your feet, and every symbol around you seems alive with sacred meaning. But unknown to most supplicants, the spiritual atmosphere was not merely mystical, it was engineered. The chants, the fumes, the dramatic pauses, the trembling of the priestess all formed part of a choreography older than memory, designed to make the seeker feel small, dependent, and spiritually exposed. This emotional vulnerability was the true currency of the oracle, and those who controlled it understood perfectly how to use it. For many, the oracle's words shaped marriages, wars, coronations, and even the founding of entire cities. But what almost no one questions is who shaped the oracle herself. Behind every prophecy stood a hidden circle of interpreters and spiritual authorities who filtered, adjusted, and sometimes completely rewrote the supposed voice of the divine. These ancient spiritual leaders understood human psychology long before the concept had a name. They recognized that fear wrapped in holiness could move armies, destroy reputations, and elevate the undeserving to unimaginable power. And this raises a disturbing truth. The authority of the Greek oracles was not built solely on divine inspiration, but on a cultivated aura of mystery, secrecy, and spiritual dependence. When a prophecy seemed too convenient for those in power or too destructive for those who questioned the system, it was no accident. Someone, somewhere, understood how to bend destiny by bending belief itself. Have you ever wondered how many lives were quietly redirected because a priest decided what the gods supposedly wanted? You might already sense that what lies ahead goes far deeper than the romanticized version of ancient spirituality we often hear. The hidden mechanisms, the emotional manipulation, the symbolic dominance, the spiritual intimidation, these elements reveal a darker layer of the ancient world, one rarely exposed. You have probably never seen the oracles through this lens, but once you do, it becomes impossible to forget. You already feel the ground shifting, don't you? And what you are about to discover may challenge everything you assumed about sacred authority in the ancient world. Before we move deeper into these forgotten shadows, tell me in the comments. What surprised you the most so far? Leave your like and make sure you are subscribed to the channel, because understanding this kind of content builds a foundation for what comes next. And what comes next may open doors you did not even know were there. The deeper you go into the hidden world of the Greek oracles, the more you realize that their power did not rely solely on spoken prophecy, but on the intricate, silent rituals that prepared the mind of the seeker long before a single divine word was uttered. These rituals were subtle, calculated, and layered with symbolism that worked beneath conscious awareness. To the ordinary worshiper, every gesture, every sound, every breath of incense seemed to be part of a sacred tradition inherited from the gods themselves. But to the spiritual authorities behind the scenes, these were psychological tools carefully refined through generations of experimentation. Most supplicants arrived already burdened with fear, uncertainty, or guilt, and the priests understood perfectly how to amplify these emotions. Before entering the sanctuary, individuals were often guided through narrow passageways, dimly lit corridors, or waiting chambers where silence felt heavy and watchful. This manufactured stillness made the visitor increasingly receptive, increasingly suggestible, and increasingly convinced that something supernatural was about to unfold. A person in such a state becomes easier to steer, easier to influence, easier to shape into a believer willing to accept whatever message is given. Then came the sensory manipulation. Flickering torchlight distorted shadows, creating the illusion of movement where there was none. The smell of burning herbs, chosen not for their sacred meaning but for their mind-altering effects, softened boundaries between fear and awe. Even the slight tremors in the voice of the priestess were not always spontaneous. Many were trained to employ breath control, deliberate pauses, and tones that evoked an atmosphere of revelation. To the untrained mind, these details felt divine. To the spiritual orchestrators, they were mechanisms of influence. But perhaps the most powerful element was the ritual sequence itself. Supplicants were asked to wash their hands, touch sacred stones, or ingest blessed water before receiving the prophecy. These acts served not only as purification symbols, but as commitments. Each step drew the seeker more deeply into the spiritual framework of the oracle, making them less likely to question the outcome. The ritual became a binding contract, one that conditioned obedience by wrapping human vulnerability in layers of ceremonial authority. Once prepared, the supplicant entered the inner chamber already half convinced that the gods were speaking. By the time the priestess delivered her revelation, the ritual had done most of the work. The prophecy, whether vague or precise, was merely the final stroke in a psychological landscape meticulously crafted to direct belief. And belief, in the ancient world, was more powerful than any weapon. It could stop armies, crown kings, or condemn the innocent with a single phrase disguised as divine will. Yet what makes these rituals truly unsettling is not their theatrical brilliance, but the realization that many participants never understood how deeply they were being shaped. They believed they were stepping into a sacred realm, unaware that the ritual itself was guiding their perception, framing their interpretation, and narrowing their freedom in ways they could not see. And as we move further into this hidden reality, the question becomes more pressing. What other forces were shaping destiny long before the oracle ever spoke? As the rituals softened the mind and framed the emotional state of the seeker, another hidden mechanism waited just beyond the veil of incense and mystery: the interpretation. The priestess may have delivered an ecstatic murmur, a fragmented phrase, or a cryptic utterance, but the true power rested with those who shaped these raw fragments into a message. These interpreters, standing at the threshold between the divine and the mortal, became the architects of destiny. And what the world rarely acknowledges is how easily a prophecy could be bent, stretched, or engineered to suit the ambitions of those who claimed spiritual authority. The oracle's words were famously ambiguous, yet this ambiguity was not an accident of mystical language. It was a tool. A prophecy that could mean two opposite outcomes ensured that no matter what unfolded, the oracle remained faultless. This cultivated infallibility reinforced loyalty, fear, and dependence. But ambiguity also offered something else: the opportunity to nudge outcomes toward a preferred direction. A subtle shift in tone, a strategic emphasis, or a carefully chosen interpretation could lead a king to war, a farmer to sacrifice, or a rival to ruin. Behind the curtain, councils of priests discussed the political climate, the tensions between city-states, the ambitions of rulers, and the alliances shifting beneath the surface of Greek society. They knew which generals sought glory, which families thirsted for influence, and which leaders threatened the balance they hoped to maintain. When a powerful figure approached the oracle, the message delivered was rarely neutral. It carried the fingerprints of those who understood. That shaping belief was a way of shaping history itself. And because the oracle was seen as the mouthpiece of the gods, no one dared oppose a prophecy. A king who doubted the message risked appearing defiant toward divine will. A citizen who questioned the interpretation risked being labeled impious. This spiritual pressure created an environment where the interpreters operated with unprecedented freedom. Their voice became the voice of Apollo, their judgment, the judgment of ancient divinity. And in a world where divine approval was more valuable than gold, this gave them influence beyond the reach of armies or laws. In some cases, the distortion was subtle, almost invisible. A warning could be framed as a challenge, a blessing could be delivered with hesitation, or a prediction could be expressed in a tone that favored one outcome over another. But there were darker moments when prophecies were deliberately weaponized. Rivals could be undermined with ominous messages. Ambitious leaders could be manipulated into conflicts that weakened their power. Entire cities could be steered toward alliances that benefited the priesthood rather than the people. Yet the most unsettling aspect lies in how seamlessly these manipulations blended with sincerity. The interpreters often believed they were guiding society toward stability, preventing chaos, or protecting sacred tradition. And because belief itself is malleable, they rarely saw the line between spiritual duty and personal influence. Their conviction made their guidance feel righteous, even when it redirected the fates of thousands. By the time a prophecy reached the ears of the supplicant, it carried layers of intention, fear, political pressure, and spiritual theater. The seeker, unaware of these invisible threads, absorbed the message as truth. And with that acceptance, another life, another decision, another turning point of history quietly shifted course, shaped not by the gods, but by the hands of those who understood how fragile human belief could be. For those who received a prophecy that challenged their desires or ambitions, disobedience might have seemed like a tempting path. But in the world shaped by the Greek oracles, defying the divine message was not merely an act of personal rebellion. It was a direct challenge to a system built on fear, reverence, and unquestioned spiritual authority. And the priests who guarded this system had more than ritual and symbolism at their disposal. They wielded something far more insidious: consequences designed to break the will of anyone bold enough to reject the oracle's decree. Outwardly, the oracles appeared as benevolent intermediaries, offering guidance and protection through sacred insight. Yet behind the sanctified image existed a network of subtle punishments that ensured obedience. These were not crude physical penalties that left visible marks. They were psychological, social, and spiritual forms of coercion that infiltrated every aspect of a person's life. The genius of these punishments lay in their invisibility. To the outside world, they seemed like misfortunes sent by the gods. To the inner circle of priests, they were carefully orchestrated reminders of the cost of resistance. One of the most common punishments was public spiritual shaming. A seeker who ignored a prophecy might later return to request clarification, only to find themselves confronted by a priesthood that refused to acknowledge their sincerity. They might be accused of impurity, arrogance, or sacrilege. Rumors would begin to spread among the faithful, whispers growing into narratives that painted the individual as cursed or out of harmony with divine will. In a society where reputation was tied to spiritual legitimacy, such whispers could dismantle a person's influence, destroy alliances, or isolate them entirely. There were also symbolic punishments embedded within ritual practice. A person who defied a prophecy could be denied access to sacred rites, excluded from communal ceremonies, or subtly positioned as an object of suspicion. A priest might offer a blessing with a cold tone, or a ritual cleansing might be performed with deliberate hesitation, signaling to all present that something was spiritually wrong. These gestures, though small, carried immense weight in a culture where divine favor was believed to govern health, fortune, and even survival. Some punishments were more direct. A prophecy could be twisted upon a person, reframed in later interpretations as a warning they had ignored. Misfortunes that naturally occurred, failed harvests, illness, economic loss, were publicly tied to their disobedience. Even if the oracle had nothing to do with the event, the narrative ensured that others saw the individual as an example. In this way, punishment became a communal spectacle disguised as divine justice. The psychological impact was enormous. Knowing that the priests could shape public perception, manipulate spiritual rituals, or redefine the meaning of fate itself kept most people loyal to the oracle, even when the prophecy conflicted with their deepest desires. And for those who dared to resist, the consequences served as a lesson for generations. These hidden mechanisms of control allowed the priesthood to maintain unchallenged authority. Few questioned the oracle's legitimacy when they could see the supposed wrath of the gods falling upon those who strayed from the prophetic path. And with each act of punishment, the invisible chains binding society grew stronger, reinforcing a cycle of obedience that lasted centuries. Before we shift deeper into the shadows of these ancient practices, tell me in the comments what you think someone of that era must have felt under such spiritual pressure. A single sentence is enough and helps me understand your perspective as we continue. The deeper you move into the hidden structure of the ancient oracles, the clearer it becomes that the priestesses themselves were not simply passive vessels of divine messages. They were central pillars of a system built on secrecy, selective knowledge, and carefully protected spiritual authority. To the public, they appeared as chosen intermediaries touched by the sacred, women whose voices carried the weight of celestial will. But behind this ethereal image existed layers of training, conditioning, and guarded techniques that ensured their words could shape the destiny of entire communities. The first secret sustaining their power was the cultivation of mystique. From a young age, selected women were isolated from ordinary life and immersed in an environment that blurred the boundary between identity and ritual. Their gestures, breathing patterns, and vocal tones were not spontaneous gifts, but practices honed over years. This cultivated persona made every movement seem otherworldly, every whisper charged with divine authority. To an observer, their presence alone reinforced the belief that some invisible force moved through them. Another hidden element was their knowledge of human vulnerability. While the public saw the priestess enter an altered state, she understood how to read the trembling hands, the hesitant voices, the emotional fragility of those seeking guidance. She learned how to respond with ambiguous phrases that resonated deeply yet revealed little, offering comfort or warning depending on what she sensed in the supplicant. This intuitive skill, sharpened through repeated encounters, gave the appearance of supernatural perception. In reality, it was a refined mastery of subtle cues and psychological nuance, but the true foundation of their spiritual power was access to information that most citizens could never imagine circulated within the temple walls. Merchants, travelers, local leaders, and petitioners brought personal stories, political tensions, private fears, and whispered confessions into these sanctuaries. Over time, the priestesses became repositories of communal memory. They knew which families were fractured, which alliances were unstable, and which ambitions simmered below the surface. A prophecy shaped from this reservoir of hidden knowledge could strike with uncanny precision, reinforcing the illusion that the gods themselves had spoken. Their authority was also strengthened by ritual constraints that protected them from scrutiny. No one was allowed to question their methods, observe their preparation, or interrupt their ecstatic state. This separation created a psychological distance, elevating them beyond the reach of ordinary logic. The less the public understood about how prophecies were produced, the more divine they appeared. And with mystery came obedience. Even the physical environment played a role. The chambers where they delivered their messages were engineered to amplify their presence. Acoustics enhanced their voices, architectural choices funneled attention toward them, and sensory manipulation intensified the perceived sanctity of their words. A whisper could echo like a revelation. A pause could feel like communion with the unseen. The experience was designed not only to convince the seeker, but to transform them. Yet the most guarded secret was the internal hierarchy that guided these women. They were not independent figures, but part of a tightly controlled spiritual lattice. Their training, their allowed movements, even their interpretations were monitored by higher authorities. Within the temple structure, this ensured that no prophecy drifted too far from the system's interests, and no priestess gained enough influence to challenge the institution itself. Their spiritual power was immense, but always tethered. When you begin to see these layers, the image of the oracle shifts from divine miracle to crafted mechanism. And as the structure becomes clearer, the question grows heavier. How much of what ancient societies believed to be sacred was shaped by those who understood the fragile nature of belief and the immense power that came from guiding it? As the veil lifts further, you begin to see that the oracles did not merely influence ordinary citizens. They held sway over the most powerful figures of the ancient world. Kings, generals, and statesmen sought their guidance before wars, political reforms, marriages, and territorial expansions. Yet beneath the solemnity of these consultations, an intricate network of emotional manipulation shaped the decisions of men who commanded armies and determined the fate of nations. The priests understood one timeless truth. Even the strongest leaders are vulnerable when standing at the crossroads of fear, ambition, and destiny. For a ruler, the act of approaching an oracle already hinted at uncertainty. The weight of expectation from their people, the pressure of maintaining power, and the fear of making a catastrophic choice turned them into ideal subjects for manipulation. The temples recognized this vulnerability and exploited it with precision. Before a prophecy was spoken, the atmosphere was crafted to magnify the leader's emotional state. Elaborate rituals, exaggerated reverence, and dramatic silences reinforced the idea that the decision ahead was monumental, far beyond the reach of human judgment alone. The priesthood also knew how to tailor emotions to specific circumstances. A general preparing for war might be confronted with ominous imagery, symbolic gestures, or carefully phrased warnings that amplified doubt. A king seeking expansion might be encouraged with prophetic visions of divine favor, giving him the confidence to pursue aggressive strategies. These emotional cues did not merely influence their beliefs, They reshaped their internal narratives, guiding them toward actions that aligned with the temple's interests or the political outcomes the priesthood preferred. Furthermore, the interpretative ambiguity of the oracles offered enormous leverage. If a ruler hesitated, the prophecy could be reframed as a test of courage. If he grew reckless, the message could be softened into reassurance. Emotional manipulation was woven not into the prophecy itself, but into how it was presented and contextualized. The priests understood what each leader feared losing most, be it legacy, loyalty, or divine approval. They also understood what each leader desired most deeply. These insights allowed them to nudge decisions with almost invisible precision. Another layer of influence stemmed from public expectation. When a powerful leader consulted the oracle, the outcome became a matter of communal attention. The priests could subtly shape how the prophecy was recorded, shared, or interpreted by the public. A hesitant king might find himself pressured by citizens who believed the gods demanded action. A general known for hesitation could be cornered by an interpretation that framed caution as disobedience. The emotional manipulation extended beyond the chamber. It followed the ruler into every arena of his life. Yet, perhaps the most unsettling aspect was how these emotional tactics were disguised as spiritual wisdom. Kings believed they were receiving divine clarity, not that their fears were being heightened or redirected. Generals felt empowered by heavenly guidance, unaware that their confidence had been deliberately inflated. The oracle's emotional influence was effective precisely because it hid beneath a veneer of holiness, making leaders think they were acting out the will of the gods. As this web of subtle manipulation grows clearer, the immense power of the priesthood comes into sharper focus. The ability to influence leaders emotionally was not merely a political tool. It was a foundation of control that shaped the course of wars, alliances, and dynasties. And as we move deeper into the hidden layers of this ancient system, you begin to sense that the oracles were never passive observers of history, but silent architects guiding events from the shadows. As you reach the darker heart of the oracle system, you begin to find stories that ancient writers avoided recording, accounts so unsettling that they survived only through fragmented whispers, obscure inscriptions, or private testimonies buried beneath layers of time. These were not the familiar tales celebrated in poetry or carved into temple walls. They were the hidden chronicles of spiritual coercion, psychological domination, and extreme abuses that unfolded behind the sanctity of ritual. And their very disappearance from mainstream history reveals how deeply the priesthood feared the exposure of their methods. The most striking cases involved individuals whose lives were dismantled entirely through manipulated prophecies. Some were told that a curse followed them, that the gods rejected their presence, or that their future held inevitable tragedy unless they submitted to specific demands. These messages were not revelations. They were tools. A priest or council could isolate a powerful figure by branding them spiritually dangerous, ensuring they lost allies, influence, and social standing. Once marked in this way, even family members distanced themselves, fearing divine retribution. Other cases described how supplicants were psychologically broken through repeated consultations. A person might return seeking guidance, only to receive messages that contradicted one another or amplified their fears. Over time, this spiritual confusion eroded their ability to trust their own judgment. They became dependent on the oracle for every decision, large or small, their lives shrinking into a cycle of ritual visits and anxious waiting. Such dependency made them easy to control, and temple authorities often used it to secure offerings, political leverage, or influence over family estates. Some abuses targeted communities rather than individuals. A village suffering from drought might be told that a single resident carried divine impurity, effectively turning neighbors into executioners of the oracle's will. Entire groups were ostracized, punished, or expelled based on prophetic declarations that served broader political or territorial interests. These actions, cloaked in divine authority, rarely faced resistance. After all, who would dare oppose a warning attributed to the gods? Yet the most disturbing accounts involve ritualized fear. Some temples staged controlled environments designed to overwhelm the senses of a chosen individual, making them believe they were witnessing signs, apparitions, or divine punishments. These orchestrated experiences reinforced obedience and silenced dissent. A terrified mind becomes pliable, and the priests knew exactly how far they needed to push before the fear became irreversible. What tied these extreme cases together was the secrecy surrounding them. No official records mentioned them, bards never sang of them, historians passed over them in silence. The temple institutions understood that their power depended on maintaining an image of divine purity. If the public discovered how prophecy could be used as a weapon, the foundation of their authority would crumble. So these stories faded into the margins, surviving only in fragments that force us to question how much of ancient spirituality was built not on enlightenment, but on hidden suffering. And yet, even in these shadows, there is something revealing. When abuses must be hidden, it is because they contain truths capable of reshaping our understanding of an entire civilization. These forgotten acts show that behind every sacred symbol, every whispered prophecy, every ritual drenched in incense, lay human intentions capable of both guidance and profound cruelty. Before we continue unfolding what remains concealed, share in the comments which part of this hidden history struck you the most. Even a short phrase helps illuminate how these forgotten stories resonate with you. The more you follow the threads woven by the ancient oracles, the clearer it becomes that their influence extended far beyond personal consultations or private tragedies. The temples themselves operated as powerful political engines, quietly steering the course of entire regions. They positioned themselves not merely as spiritual sanctuaries, but as invisible arbiters of diplomacy, conflict, and territorial ambition. And because their authority appeared divine, rulers rarely questioned the origin of the advice that shaped their kingdoms. This allowed the priesthood to shape history from behind a veil of sanctity. City-states across Greece often sought the oracle's blessing before forming alliances or declaring war. What few realized was how deeply the temples understood the shifting landscape of political tensions. They received envoys from every direction, each bearing gifts, grievances, rumors, and strategic intentions. Temple authorities collected these details, building an informal intelligence network more sophisticated than any royal spy system. With this knowledge, the priests could craft prophecies that subtly directed states into actions favorable to the temple's long-term goals. When rival powers competed for influence, the oracles often played both sides. A general from one city might hear a prophecy encouraging caution, while his opponent received a message urging boldness. Neither realized that the temple benefited regardless of the outcome, as both consultations reinforced their dependence on divine insight. Even in times of peace, the priesthood carefully fanned political tensions, offering ambiguous predictions that stimulated uncertainty. Uncertainty kept leaders coming back, seeking answers, offering tribute, and revealing sensitive information. Economic influence also played a role. Temples sat at the intersection of trade routes, receiving offerings of gold, livestock, grain, and precious goods. A prophecy that favored one trading partner over another could shift the flow of commerce. When a state grew economically dependent on a particular route or alliance, the temple gained leverage. Leaders feared displeasing the oracle, for a poorly timed warning could unravel years of political negotiation. Thus, temples became silent brokers of economic strategy, disguising their interventions as divine counsel. At times, their influence altered the trajectory of entire wars. A king poised to invade a neighboring territory might be told that victory required a specific sacrifice or ritual. This often delayed military campaigns, giving rival states time to fortify defenses. In other cases, a prophecy urging immediate action pushed armies into battles they were not prepared to fight, serving larger geopolitical balances that the priesthood sought to preserve. Whatever the outcome, the oracle retained its aura of authority, for ambiguous prophecies could be interpreted as fulfilled no matter what transpired. The most disturbing aspect of this influence was how seamlessly it blended into everyday governance. Leaders believed they were acting with divine approval, unaware that their decisions were being subtly redirected by those who understood the psychology of power. A confident ruler could be made uncertain, a hesitant leader emboldened, a peaceful alliance fractured, or a fragile region pushed to conflict. And because these interventions appeared as sacred insight, not manipulation, the priesthood maintained plausible deniability while shaping events that historians later attributed to political miscalculation or fate. When viewed from this perspective, the temples emerged not as passive institutions, but as strategic actors with long-reaching agendas. Their ability to influence wars without drawing a single weapon, to redirect alliances without issuing a public decree, and to mold kings through the illusion of divine authority reveals a level of power unmatched by any earthly institution of their time. And as You move further into these shadows, the realization grows that the spiritual and political realms were never truly separate. They were threads woven tightly together, each strengthening the other in ways ancient societies seldom recognized. As the layers of ritual, prophecy, and political influence come into focus, one truth becomes increasingly undeniable. The oracles did not survive for centuries merely because people respected them. They endured because the priesthood understood the deeper architecture of human psychology long before such knowledge had a name. Their power was not held by force, nor by legal authority, but by a mastery of fear, hope, expectation, and cognitive conditioning that shaped the minds of entire communities. Through these mechanisms, the population remained bound to the temples, convinced that obedience was safety and questioning was peril. The first psychological tool was the illusion of omnipresence. Temples were positioned at strategic locations, often elevated above the city or resting along pilgrimage routes. Their constant visibility reminded citizens that the divine gaze was never far away. Stories circulated about those who ignored prophetic guidance and suffered misfortune, weaving a cultural tapestry where coincidence became proof of divine judgment. Over generations, people internalized the belief that the gods watched every decision, and the oracle spoke as their supreme interpreter. The second mechanism was controlled: uncertainty. Prophecies were deliberately ambiguous, encouraging the seeker to fill the gaps with their own fears or desires. This ambiguity created a cycle of introspection that anchored the prophecy deeply within the mind. When events occurred, even if unrelated, people interpreted them as confirmations of the oracle's message. This self-reinforcement strengthened faith while diminishing the impulse to question the priesthood. Doubt became a personal failing, not a rational response. Another powerful tool was communal reinforcement. Festivals, rituals, and public ceremonies centered around the temples created a shared emotional experience. When an entire community witnessed offerings, chants, or blessings, each individual felt their belief validated by the collective. Even those who privately doubted the oracle found themselves swept into conformity, fearing the social consequences of appearing impious. The psychological weight of belonging ensured that skepticism rarely transformed into open resistance. The priesthood also tapped into existential vulnerability. Life in the ancient world was unpredictable. Disease, famine, death, and war loomed constantly over the population. In such an environment, spiritual certainty offered comfort. The oracles provided explanations for suffering, guidance during chaos, and the promise that the gods had a plan, even when life seemed directionless. This emotional refuge created a powerful bond between the people and the temples. The more unstable the world felt, the stronger the oracle's hold became. Ritual participation deepened this bond. Each touch of sacred water, each step into a darkened chamber, each whispered prayer fostered a sense of personal connection to the divine. Rituals created emotional imprints that lingered long after the ceremony ended. These repeated sensory experiences shaped the brain's associations, linking obedience to safety and disobedience to danger. Over time, individuals no longer needed explicit warnings. Their minds supplied them automatically. Even the physical sensations of prophecy reinforced submission. The acoustics of temple chambers, the resonant voices of priestesses, the scent of burning herbs, the rhythmic chants, all cultivated trance-like states. In these moments, the seeker felt suspended between worlds, receptive to guidance that seemed to come from beyond. The emotional intensity of such experiences made the oracle's authority feel undeniable. In the end, these psychological mechanisms formed an invisible cage, one built not of stone or iron, but of belief and conditioned response. People obeyed the oracle not because they were forced to, but because they could no longer imagine life without its guidance. And once a society reaches that point, control becomes effortless, subtle, and nearly impossible to dismantle. As the full structure behind the Greek oracles comes into view, it becomes difficult to see them merely as relics of a distant age. Their influence did not vanish when the temples crumbled or when new philosophies rose to challenge them. Instead, their legacy seeped into the foundations of how societies understand authority, belief, fear, and destiny. The dynamics crafted by the priesthood, the manipulation of emotion, the shaping of political outcomes, the conditioning of entire populations through ritual and myth, continued to echo long after the last priestess delivered her final prophecy. And when you look closely, those Echoes are still present in systems that claim to guide, protect, or enlighten people even today. The most enduring mark left by the oracles was the idea that spiritual authority could sit above scrutiny. For centuries, their words were treated as untouchable, their intentions assumed to be pure. This elevated their influence far beyond reason or evidence, allowing the manipulation of fear and hope to masquerade as sacred truth. The pattern repeated itself across civilizations. A figure or institution wrapped in myth, surrounded by ritual, granted immunity from being questioned. The temples taught the ancient world that obedience wrapped in mystery feels safe, even when it hides something corrosive beneath. Another legacy lies in the psychological blueprints the oracles perfected. The use of ambiguity to guide behavior, the exploitation of uncertainty, the weaving of social pressure into spiritual expectation. These methods survived in various forms throughout history. Whenever a leader, institution, or ideology claims to possess exclusive access to truth, you can see reflections of the oracle's structure, shaping minds through the interplay of fear, reverence, and selective revelation. The blueprint is ancient, but its mechanisms remain timeless. The oracles also left behind a cultural memory of how belief can be engineered. They showed that controlling the narrative of destiny can reshape the identity of entire peoples. Cities interpreted victories, defeats, plagues, and prosperity through the lens of prophetic meaning. These interpretations influenced art, literature, law, and tradition. Even modern understandings of fate, intuition, and divine communication bear subtle traces of that era when a trembling voice behind a veil could redirect the path of nations. Yet perhaps the most haunting part of this legacy is the silence surrounding the victims. Those who were spiritually coerced, publicly shamed, psychologically broken, or politically manipulated rarely appear in the surviving texts. Their stories live only in fractured hints, overshadowed by the grandeur of temples and the poetry of prophecy. And this silence reminds us how easily historical memory can be shaped by those who hold authority over narrative. The absence of these voices is itself part of the oracle's power, lingering like a shadow over the centuries. As you step back and observe this entire structure, from rituals that softened the mind to prophecies that redirected kings, you begin to understand why the oracles fascinated ancient societies. They offered something irresistible, the illusion that uncertainty could be tamed, that destiny could be interpreted, that the gods themselves could be approached for answers. But behind that comfort lay a sophisticated system that molded belief, shaped politics, and controlled populations with extraordinary subtlety. And now that this hidden architecture has unfolded before you, the question that remains is how much of this influence continues, quietly woven into the way humans still search for meaning, authority, and reassurance in forces they cannot fully see. If you reach the end of this journey, leave a comment saying, "This message was meant for me," because it helps me know who stayed with this story until its final breath. And if this exploration opened something new for you, make sure you are subscribed, because understanding how ancient power shaped human belief gives depth to everything that comes. Next, leave your like as well. It strengthens this space we are building together. And when you are ready, there is another video waiting beside this one that expands these shadows even further. Click and continue the journey with me.